My name is Paige Ryder. At 33 years old, I committed an act that my entire family considered absolute madness. I withdrew every single cent of my savings from the bank and blew it all on buying an abandoned, dilapidated gas station on the outskirts of town. On the day I signed the paperwork at the real estate agency, my mother Lorna looked me dead in the eye and said I was a complete fool and a disgrace. My father, Dexter, stood silently by the window with his jaw clenched, not even bothering to glance in my direction. And my older brother Tyler just openly laughed, calling me a hopeless loser who had finally found her ideal place, among the garbage and old scrap metal. They turned around and walked out before the ink from my pen had even dried on the final page of the contract. Exactly 1 week later, I was standing in pitch darkness behind that very same gas station. In my hands, I held a high-powered flashlight and a crowbar, and before my eyes was a solid steel armored door, one that someone had meticulously sealed off under a thick layer of plaster and hidden behind drywall half a century ago. The discovery I made behind that sealed door didn't just change my financial life forever. It completely obliterated the beautiful, flawless fairy tale of honest hard work that my family had proudly been preaching to the entire town for the last 40 years. And when I finally revealed the whole truth at a grand gala event honoring my father, where the city's entire elite had gathered, the huge room of 200 people simply froze in utter shock. On that cool September day, the single conference room at Oak Creek Title was suffocating. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My entire family had shown up uninvited. I didn't know for sure who had leaked the closing time to them, but I was willing to bet it was Ross Fletcher, the realtor who had tipped me off about the property in the first place. My father, Dexter Ryder, entered the office first. His stride, as always, was heavy and deliberate, the walk of a man who considered himself the undisputed ruler of the entire county. My mother paraded in behind him. She sat on the edge of the leather chair across from me, clutching her expensive handbag so tightly you'd think she was in a den of thieves. In front of me on the desk lay a cashier's check for $41,000. It was every last penny I had managed to save over 11 years of grueling, relentless work, earned through my own sweat, penny by penny. The escrow officer, a young girl clearly feeling out of her element due to my family's hostile presence, nervously slid the deed transfer documents toward me. My mother leaned forward and whispered, quietly enough for the whole room to hear, "You're throwing your entire life into the trash, Paige. You've completely lost your mind." I calmly pulled out my pen and removed the cap. My father didn't even condescend to sit down. He walked over to the panoramic window, stood with his back to me, hands thrust into his trousers pockets, and barked, "Real riders build businesses from scratch and raise empires. You dig through other people's scraps and pick up what normal people threw away." That hit was calculated and precise. He knew exactly how to press my sorest buttons. Tyler leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, crossed his arms over his chest, and smirked his signature, vile smirk. "You know what you really are, sis?" he drawled with blatant mockery. "You're a hopeless loser, a life fail, and this dump is the ultimate proof." I signed my name, clear, sweeping, and firm. My hand didn't even tremble, which genuinely surprised me. It felt as if a switch had been flipped inside me. All those years spent trying to earn their approval burned away in an instant. The real estate agent cleared her throat nervously and asked where to send the final recorded copy of the document. "Both to my email and by regular mail to my new address," I answered, wiping the ink from my fingers. My family turned and left in a unified front. My father never once looked my way. From the second-floor window, I silently watched their vehicles pull out of the parking lot one after another. First my father's massive, gleaming pickup truck, followed by Tyler's sports car, and closing the procession was my mother's executive sedan. 3 pairs of red taillights drifted off toward the city center. Into a life where there was no longer any room for me, I was left alone in the empty office. In my hands was a folder containing documents for a dead, abandoned gas station, a 10-minute drive down Highway 14. And my bank account, after the check had cleared, held exactly $84.16. There was no turning back. I had fought for my right to take this step, but in that very minute, I had permanently lost my family. In Oak Creek, legends were told about our family, while I was considered the sole black sheep in the Ryder flock, a person who messed up absolutely everything she touched. But if anyone had bothered to look the dry facts in the face, the reality would have turned out to be far more rotten and unfair. For almost 6 years, I worked as the head accountant at Ryder Land Development, my father's construction company. I managed all the documentation, tracked every cent entering and leaving the company, and worked without a single mistake. But in late 2019, while filing major tax documents for a commercial plot near the county road, I uncovered a wild discrepancy. The figures Tyler demanded I enter into the financial statements categorically did not match the actual cash flow. It was blatant, off-the-books accounting and an attempt to evade nearly $300,000 in taxes. I submitted 2 official internal memos addressed to my father and Tyler. In response, my brother simply walked into my office, locked the door, and told me to keep my nose out of things that didn't concern me, adding that I didn't know a damn thing about real business and strategic planning. And when county auditors naturally raised questions about the report, the key documents bore exclusively my initials as head accountant. Tyler's signature, of course, was nowhere to be found. He had technically washed his hands clean. My father didn't even bother to investigate back then. He simply called me into his office and said he trusted his son more, accusing me of creating problems out of thin air and framing the family business. I didn't stage a public war, throw folders, or run to the courts. A public scandal with my own father felt like setting fire to my own house at the time. I simply wrote a quiet letter of resignation and walked away into the unknown. Then I tried to get back on my feet by myself. I rented a tiny office on 5th Street and opened a private practice, Ryder Accounting and Audit. For 2 years, I worked without weekends, honestly helping small businesses, and the money was plenty for a modest life and rent. But early this year, my largest client, a local general contractor who owed me a massive sum for 8 months of work, unexpectedly declared bankruptcy. All my receivables and expected income went down the drain. In March, I had to close the office, and my remaining cash went toward clearing the lease so I wouldn't leave behind any debt. By nature, I am a person who reads even the finest print 3 times over. I am hyper-responsible to a fault. My old boss in my youth called it a painful conscience. I was used to silently carrying other people's mistakes, negligence, and debts on my shoulders, treating it as my duty. That was my main weakness, and my family knew it all too well, unashamedly exploiting my conscience for years. That is precisely why, when Ross Fletcher approached me 3 weeks ago and offered an asset that every investor in the county had turned down, at a price that allowed me to become the sole owner without taking out a single loan, I agreed. I should have asked myself right then why a hardened hustler was suddenly showing such touchingly deep concern for Dexter Ryder's struggling daughter. Later, I did ask myself that question, but the answer cost me far too much. Ross Fletcher was a well-known figure in Oak Creek, a typical slimy property flipper. He bought up distressed properties, slapped cheap paint over deep rot, and flipped them to out-of-towners or inexperienced buyers who didn't know how to check property registries. Most importantly, for the past 5 years, he had been running off-the-record errands for my father and Tyler. And that should have been a massive red flag. He sat next to me in a small diner off Highway 14, glanced around conspiratorially, and whispered that he had an exclusive option. Carmichael's old gas station. It had been sitting closed since 1987. The sellers, distant heirs on the East Coast, were ready to let it go for just $41,000 cash. "Paige, the land alone is worth more than that on the tax assessment," he urged me, spraying spit. "They're just too lazy to come down here and deal with the paperwork. Sign the papers, and you're the owner of your own land." It all sounded suspiciously smooth, but I was a professional accountant. I didn't take his word for it. The next day I went to the county recorder's office and pulled the entire ownership history of the plot back to the 1930s. No liens, no encumbrances, no pending lawsuits, no third-party claims. Then I filed an official request with the County Environmental Protection Department. Old gas stations always carry one huge risk: underground steel fuel tanks. If they rust through, fuel leaks into the soil, and environmental cleanup fines can run into hundreds of thousands. However, the official Environmental Archive confirmed that in 1991, under a state program for decommissioning old stations, all underground tanks had been removed, and the soil had been remediated and certified. After that, I drove out to the property twice and paid my last $200 to Wayne, a retired building inspector, for a quick structural assessment. Wayne tapped the walls, inspected the foundation, and gave his verdict. The load-bearing frame and brickwork were in ideal condition and would easily last another 50 years, though the roof trusses and roofing would need a complete replacement. Everything added up. The math didn't lie. The price was dirt cheap only because the station sat on an old stretch of Highway 14, where main traffic had vanished after the construction of the new bypass 2 kilometers away. I bought that station because it was my only chance to break out of the vicious cycle, a chance to start over completely on my own, with my own hard-earned money, where no one could rub my nose in it and claim I owed anything to the Ryder family. The only thing I failed to notice that day at the diner was the strange, expectant look on Ross Fletcher's face when I told him I was buying the property in cash and flatly declining his offer for a realtor-recommended inspection. Ross had broken into a satisfied smile, patted my shoulder patronizingly, and tossed out, "Atta girl, Paige, a real chip off the old block." And as he walked out to the parking lot, I saw through the window as he immediately pulled out his phone and dialed a number, excitedly reporting something to his caller. In our small town, the Ryder name carried more weight than gold. My grandfather, Lyle Ryder, came to these parts in the 1930s literally with holes in his pants and empty pockets, yet by the end of his life, he owned half the commercial space on Main Street. My father built upon that success with the aggression of a bulldozer. He turned Ryder Land Development into a true construction titan, filling the entire county with residential subdivisions and shopping centers over the last 30 years. A new wing at the local hospital bore his name. At the local high school, top students were annually awarded the Dexter Ryder Merit Scholarship. In Oak Creek, our surname wasn't viewed merely as a family name, but as an institution. And this very autumn, the town's Chamber of Commerce was preparing to award my father their highest honor, the Citizen of the Year Award, at the annual gala. It was the biggest event of the year. The mayor, the press, the business elite, 200 invited guests. My father had been the undisputed king of these parts for as long as I could remember. I grew up brainwashed by a strict ideology. The Ryder name is an ironclad brand. You have no right to screw up, you have no right to question your father's authority, and you certainly have no right to make the family a laughingstock by buying an abandoned heap of junk on an old highway right before your father's finest hour. My mother threw a full-blown hysterical fit over the phone, claiming I had bought the gas station purely to publicly humiliate my father and ruin his award ceremony. But that was a blatant lie. I was simply grabbing at the last lifeline I had to keep from ending up on the street. I knew October was coming. My father would stand on stage under the flash of cameras, accepting a crystal trophy and applause. But even in my worst nightmares, I couldn't have imagined that this very stage would become the place where their 40-year-old fake empire would collapse like a house of cards. On the very first night after finalizing the deed, I took my old work Ford, loaded the trunk with a powerful LED work light, a thermos of hot coffee, a few tools, and drove out to the site. Carmichael Station looked impossibly lonely and eerie in the night darkness. 2 rusted 1950s fuel pumps with shattered dials stood by the roadside like twin skeletons. Behind them loomed the single-story convenience store building, its windows caked in dust and thick cobwebs. I walked up to the front door, inserted the flat old key into the lock, and turned it. The door gave way with a heavy groan. The smell hit my nose immediately, a thick, deeply embedded stench accumulated over decades. A mix of old diesel fuel, motor oil, dry dust, and something else. Something damp, resembling wet stone, lime, and aging plaster. It was the smell of a sealed, dead space that hadn't seen the light of day in 40 years. I walked through the main retail area. Peeling metal display racks, glassless refrigerator units, and a heavy mechanical cash register still sat in place. Behind the shop floor was a small back room, roughly 12 by 18 feet. Complete chaos reigned there. Collapsed, rotted shelving, piles of decayed cardboard boxes, and debris. The back wall of this utility room was paneled with dark brown fiberboard, clearly a cheap renovation job from the mid-'80s. I approached the wall, ran my hand along it to brush away cobwebs, and out of habit, knocked on it with my knuckles. The side concrete walls answered with a dull, solid thud. But when I knocked on the rear fiberboard panel, the sound changed abruptly. It was hollow, echoing, and deep. Exactly the kind of sound you get when behind a thin partition lies not a narrow wall cavity, but a vast, deep, empty space. What's more, when I lowered my flashlight to the floor, I noticed a distinct cold draft seeping out from the gap between the baseboard and the fiberboard panel. An icy, bone-dry current of air was blowing directly onto my feet. I stood in that gloomy back room in complete silence for a long time, pressing my palm against the cold panel. In my pocket lay my last $84. Behind me was the utter contempt of my family, and the wall of the abandoned store seemed to be quietly, deeply breathing back at me out of the dark. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old ventilation shaft or an ordinary root cellar the sellers had forgotten about, but I couldn't fall asleep that night. My mother called me the next morning at 8 sharp, just as I was sitting in my small kitchen trying to collect my thoughts over a cup of cheap instant coffee. Skipping any form of greeting, she immediately unleashed a torrent of accusations. "Your father didn't sleep a wink all night because of your stunt," she thundered into the receiver. "Do you have any idea what's going on in town right now?" I took a sip of coffee and answered quietly, "I can take a wild guess, Mom." "You don't guess anything," Lorna fumed. "Pastor Paul sympathetically asked Dexter at church prayer breakfast today if your mental health was all right. Neighbors saw your beat-up car parked by those Carmichael ruins. Do you realize you're publicly humiliating your father right before the biggest night of his life?" Then her tone shifted abruptly to a command. "Listen to me very carefully, Paige. You will show up to the gala on Friday looking decent. You will stand next to your family in front of the photographers so the whole town sees our unity, and you will quietly get rid of that cursed plot before the end of the month. Sell it back to Ross for whatever he offers." I gripped the phone tightly. "I'm not selling anything, Mom. It's my property." An icy, heavy silence hung on the line, and then my mother delivered her famous trademark line, the one she had used to manipulate me since childhood. "Riders always stick together, Paige. Always. And if you're turning your back on us now, you're choosing for yourself who you are to us." Years ago, 5 or 10 years back, that threat would have made me cringe, burst into tears, and run to do their bidding. But now, looking out the window at the faded autumn hills beyond the town, I felt nothing but a dull, ringing emptiness. "I love you, Mom," I said calmly, "but I'm not abandoning the station. I'm sorry." And I pressed the end call button myself. If your closest relatives, the people who were supposed to be your shield and support, have ever systematically drilled into your head that you're a nobody who amounts to nothing, you know all too well how those toxic words seep into your very bones. But my story was only beginning. Hit the like button if that feeling sounds familiar to you, and let's keep going. At noon that same day, I was back on Highway 14. In the trunk of my Ford lay a heavy steel crowbar, a couple of hammers, and safety goggles. I sat at a dusty table in the front shop area and sketched out a clear, rigorous action plan in my notebook. First priority, patch the leaking roof. Next, install window panes and set up temporary electricity. I had zero budget for a crew, so I was relying entirely on my own 2 hands and barter deals with local handymen. My plan was to clean up the building and open a small auto repair shop or a cozy coffee spot for truckers and locals, just enough to cover property taxes and earn an honest living. If my project failed, I'd be on the street. I had no insurance, no savings, and no safety net. Grit my teeth, I set to work. Through 4 hours of backbreaking labor, I cleared all the rotted wooden shelving out of the back room and hauled out piles of dirt and trash that had accumulated over 40 years. By 5 in the afternoon, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from my forehead, I stood before the rear fiberboard panel with the crowbar in my hands. It was time to deal with this ventilation shaft. I jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the gap between the panels and pried with all my strength. Old nails pulled out of the decaying wood with a screech. The panel cracked and slammed to the floor, kicking up a cloud of ancient dust. A sharp, icy draft immediately blasted straight into my face from the opening. I shone my flashlight into the exposed gap and froze. Behind the decorative fiberboard wall, there was no ventilation shaft or crumbling wooden cellar. There stood a solid, flawless concrete wall at least 2 feet thick, and embedded directly into this concrete was a heavy steel door. This was no ordinary metal door you'd find in a warehouse. It was a massive armored plate featuring a rotating locking wheel and a multi-bolt locking system, identical to those used in 1930s bank vaults. Someone in the past had gone to extraordinary lengths to first coat this door in rust-inhibiting primer, seal the seams with concrete, and then completely wall it off behind cheap drywall, hoping to bury its existence forever. I stood in the dusty utility room, clutching the crowbar with white knuckles. My heart was pounding in my throat. At that moment, I realized 2 things with absolute clarity. First, this abandoned place was hiding a massive, terrifying secret. And second, right now in the entire world, absolutely no one knew about this secret except me. Part 5. The Secret Bunker and Riches from the Past. I didn't attempt to break the door down that night, and here's why. All my life, my family had considered me an impulsive fool, incapable of cold calculation. Because of that, I had learned to master my emotions and act with total composure during the most critical moments. I took dozens of detailed photographs of the steel door from every angle, recorded the condition of the concrete seals, took precise measurements of the room, and then locked the station up securely and drove home to dive into the county historical archives. I spent the next 5 hours at my computer, digging through digitized newspapers and land records for Oak Creek County spanning the last century. And here is what I managed to unearth. It turned out that the property on Highway 14 wasn't originally built as a gas station at all. In the mid-1920s, it served as a bonded customs warehouse owned by a local businessman named Glenn Carmichael. In such warehouses, under government wax seals, commercial shipments of goods were legally stored until all state import duties were paid. Most importantly, during Prohibition in the United States, these government-bonded warehouses were among the rare legal sites where vast stocks of hard liquor could be lawfully stored, specifically medical alcohol supplies for pharmacies and confiscated contraband shipments. The building only became a standard gas station with a small convenience store in 1936, when new owners bricked up the main cargo entrance, added the retail room, and simply forgot to mention the underground vault in the public property records. By 2 a.m, I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by printed floor plans. The picture fell into place. Right beneath the floor of my rundown gas station sat a secret, sealed, Prohibition-era bonded vault that no one had stepped into for nearly 90 years. At 9 the next morning, I returned to the station equipped with several cans of heavy-duty rust penetrant and a mechanical jack. For nearly 2 hours, I carefully sprayed the seized locking mechanism with solvent, tapping the massive wheel with a hammer through a wooden block. Finally, with a deafening metallic screech that made my ears ring, the locking bolts yielded and moved. Turning the wheel all the way, I pulled the heavy steel door toward me. The old cement seal crumbled into powder, and the door groaned open a couple of inches. A thick, concentrated aroma burst from the dark crevice. The scent of aged oak, damp brickwork, decaying paper, and an unmistakable, noble aroma of fine, mature spirits. I lit my flashlight, started recording video on my phone to document every single step for future legal proof, and stepped over the high steel threshold. Behind the door lay a narrow stone staircase of 12 steps, plunging steeply downward. I carefully descended. When the beam of my light sliced through the century-old darkness of the room, my breath caught in my throat. It was a massive underground vault with arched brick ceilings, at least 3 times larger in floor area than the store above. Along every wall stretched heavy oak racks holding hundreds upon hundreds of dark glass bottles in neat, orderly rows. They were packed in age-decayed straw and stowed inside wooden crates bearing crisp, aged factory stencils. I walked up to the nearest rack and, with trembling fingers, carefully pulled one bottle out of its straw casing. Hand-blown glass, a heavy dark punt at the bottom, an intact wax seal over a natural cork, and a pristine, perfectly preserved paper label. It was pure aged Scotch whiskey. Over the cork sat an untouched red U.S. government tax strip stamp bearing a crystal-clear date, 1927. My legs gave out and I sat right down on the stone floor. As an accountant, I knew the value of rare collectibles all too well. A single authentic, unopened bottle of Prohibition-era whiskey with verifiable provenance and an intact tax stamp commands anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 at major auction houses like Sotheby's or Christie's, and extremely rare limited runs can fetch tens of thousands. And here before me, in this dry vault kept at a perfect natural temperature, stood dozens of wooden crates, hundreds of bottles in flawless condition. I didn't scream with joy, I didn't take selfies, and I certainly didn't call anyone. I simply sat on the cold stone step, pulled out my notebook, and began a cold, sober inventory. After counting the crates on just the first 3 racks and multiplying the average baseline value by the number of units, I arrived at a figure that made my head spin. The sum was so astronomical that it took me 10 minutes just to learn how to breathe normally again. Throughout their lives, my family never understood one simple truth that my profession had drilled into me. Rare items or bottles are worth absolutely nothing without rock-solid legal documentation. If you discover a treasure but cannot prove the legality of its origin and your lawful rights to the land, the state or opportunistic vultures will simply confiscate every last cent, declare it contraband, put it under the hammer, and drag you through courts to boot. The difference between $1 million historical treasure and a pile of illegal old glass comes down to paperwork. That is why I spent the next 2 days in that basement, not with a glass of whiskey, but with calipers, protective gloves, and inventory sheets. I cataloged every single crate, every label, every tax stamp number, creating a detailed 30-page inventory without moving a single item from its historic resting spot. Following that, I formally reached out to a major auction house in Phoenix that specialized in rare historical artifacts and high-end spirits. I submitted a preliminary inquiry as the sole lawful owner of the property. The auction house specialist got back to me within an hour. They were ecstatic over the photos I provided, but immediately laid down one firm condition. They required archival documentation directly linking this specific consignment of alcohol to Carmichael's bonded warehouse. That was the deciding factor between a questionable private sale and a world-class historic auction. The documents. They had to be somewhere in here. I went back down to the vault and began systematically inspecting every inch of the room. In the farthest corner of the space stood a heavy oak desk, literally bolted to the stone floor with thick lag screws. Behind it, a small door was built into the wall. It took me another hour to break off the old padlock. Inside was a built-in steel safe. When I turned the handle and pulled it open, the dry smell of old paper and sealing wax rushed out. Inside lay Glenn Carmichael's ledger books, official government customs manifests with batch numbers from 1924, storage permits, and 2 documents that completely, thoroughly destroyed my family's entire legacy. They were an official promissory note and a notarized deed of assignment from March 1931. I read the buyer's name 3 times. My gloved fingers began to shake. Lyle Ryder, my own grandfather. The man whose name my father revered like a holy relic, and about whom local legends were spun as a hard-working, honest man who rose from rock bottom with his own 2 hands. The documents in the safe told a completely different, predatorily dirty story. The note proved that Grandfather Lyle had loaned money to Glenn Carmichael, who was facing ruin during the Great Depression, using this warehouse as collateral at a loan shark rate of 40% per annum, with a ruthless demand for full repayment in exactly 90 days. And a notice of foreclosure from 1933 confirmed that Lyle Ryder had used a bought-off court to seize Carmichael's entire plot, warehouse, and land for pennies on the dollar, throwing the ruined owner out onto the street. Carmichael, however, had managed to seal off the secret underground vault right before losing the property, taking its secret to his grave. I sat on the cold floor of the basement, holding direct evidence of the ultimate lie upon which the Ryder family wealth was built. Their entire storied reputation, their pride, and their arrogant superiority over me were built on a brutal, predatory land grab during the worst crisis in the nation's history. Any naive girl in my position would have rushed straight to her father, shoved those yellowed papers in his face, and screamed, "Look who you really are!" I desperately wanted to do that too, but hard life experience quickly tempered my emotions. Emotional outbursts always lead to defeat. In an open brawl, my father and his high-priced lawyers would have steamrolled me, seized the papers, or branded them as fakes. So I did what my accounting training taught me to do. I handled everything strictly by the book and without making a sound. The next day, I scanned every single document in high resolution, uploaded the files to 3 independent cloud drives, and took the physical originals to a neighboring county seat 30 miles away, locking them inside a bank safety deposit box at a national bank. I forwarded the official manifests and storage permits to the appraisers in Phoenix. Within 24 hours, the experts issued their verdict. The collection's authenticity was 100% proven. Then, alongside an independent property attorney, I re-verified my land deed once more. I was the sole, absolute, and unchallengeable owner of the Highway 14 property, including everything above and below ground. My grandfather's 1931 promissory note did not diminish my purchase rights in any way. It simply changed who held all the cards in this story. I assembled a flawless, airtight legal dossier: the land deed, a fresh title registry extract, the inventory log, the official appraisal report from the auction house, and the historical records from 1931. I didn't need to prove anything to my father or argue with him anymore. I had cold, indisputable facts sitting in front of me. On Tuesday morning, Tyler showed up at the gas station. My father never delivers blows with his own hands if he can send a pawn instead. My brother pulled his gleaming SUV right up to the entrance, walked into the shop wearing his expensive leather jacket, and began surveying my freshly painted walls with a lordly, contemptuous gaze. "Heard you decided to play archaeologist out here, sis," he drawled with a smirk, kicking a piece of construction debris out of his path. And then, without missing a beat, he got straight down to business. "Look, Paige, Dad's decided to swap anger for mercy. Ryder Development is willing to buy this dump off you at market value. We'll give you 45 grand. Save you the headache, take the property into family holdings, and you get your chump change back without embarrassing yourself." When I looked at him calmly and declined, his whole fake swagger instantly evaporated. Tyler's face twisted with anger. "Have you lost your mind?" he hissed, taking an aggressive step toward me. "This land has history tied directly to our grandfather. You have no right to sell off something that rightfully belongs to the Ryder family to complete strangers. It's unethical and dirty." "Unethical?" I could barely stop myself from laughing in his face. "And what exact history of grandfathers are you referring to, Tyler?" I asked quietly. Unable to resist the urge to show off his insider knowledge, my brother triumphantly declared, "You think you're the only smart one around? Dad told me everything. Grandfather bought this warehouse fair and square from Carmichael back in '33. This is our family's land." "Fair and square," I repeated internally. My brother didn't have the slightest clue that right now, an original promissory note proving a brutal, predatory foreclosure was sitting safely inside a bank vault. But his stupid remark confirmed the most crucial detail. My father and Tyler had always known the truth about the land's origins. They were just accustomed to believing that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes official history. Tyler spat on the floor, turned around, and tossed over his shoulder at the door. "You have until tomorrow night's gala to rethink this, Paige. If you don't sign the relinquishment papers over to Dad, you'll regret the day you were born." And the following evening, right before the main event, Dexter Ryder himself arrived at the station. He caught me cleaning up the back room in the deep dusk. My father stood silently in the doorway for a long time. For the first time in years, his face lacked its usual look of disgust. Instead, it bore a cold, predatory, calculating expression. I used to drive past this building when I was just a boy, he suddenly spoke softly, walking up to the old counter and running a finger along the wood. Dad Lyle brought me out here in his very first car. He looked at me with his heavy, piercing gaze. I'd built this town for 30 years, Paige. I poured my entire life into it. And do you know what will be left of me 30 years from now? Nothing. Names are forgotten quickly. Bronze plaques tarnish and gather dust. For a split second, I thought I glimpsed his true, deep-seated fear, a panic-driven terror of becoming a nobody and losing his absolute grip on the town he considered his personal kingdom. But a second later, he slapped his mask of an unyielding patriarch right back on. That is precisely why the family must present an iron front together, he barked. Whatever you've dug up here, it's Ryder legacy. Tomorrow at the gala, you will walk up on stage with me. You will publicly announce to the press and the mayor that we're developing this project as a joint family venture. The town needs to see who runs things here. This wasn't an offer of peace. It was an attempt to break me once again and use me as a pretty prop for his personal triumph. And if I say no, Dad? I asked quietly, looking him straight in the eye. My father looked at me with chilling coldness. Then you'll learn firsthand how fast and mercilessly this family erases those who stand against it. You won't have a job, friends, or a name left in this town. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. I was left alone in the empty building with a broom in my hands. The gala wasn't just a family celebration, it was a planned ambush, and they were dead certain I had walked right into it. Part 8. The Realtor's Scheme and the Final Plan. On Wednesday morning, an official notarized report arrived from Phoenix. The lead appraiser from the auction house, having spent over 6 hours in my vault, fully confirmed it. The discovered collection of Prohibition-era Scotch and American whiskey was entirely authentic, and the storage conditions inside the sealed vault had proven ideal. The preliminary low-estimate valuation for the collection at auction stood at $1,300,000. I sat down quietly on the wooden floor of my small kitchen and gave myself exactly 5 minutes to process that staggering figure. $1,300,000. I, the hopeless loser and disgrace of the family, was sitting on a fortune hidden inside the ruins my own father had called a money pit. 5 minutes later, I stood up. My accountant mind immediately engaged cold logic. Money that vast doesn't bring automatic safety. On the contrary, it paints a giant target on your back for predators. If my relatives were willing to steal a $40,000 property from me, I knew full well what measures they'd resort to for $1 million. So I decided to unspool the entire web and find out why Ross Fletcher had been pushing this property on me so aggressively. The answer took less than 2 hours to uncover. I reached out directly to the sellers, Glenn Carmichael's distant heirs living in Oregon. Carmichael's granddaughter admitted in our phone call that they had originally listed the plot for $65,000, but local realtor Ross Fletcher had spent months grinding them down, insisting the land was worthless, until he persuaded them to slash the price to $41,000 under the guise of a quick cash deal with a local buyer willing to inherit a mess. The puzzle pieces snapped into place. Ross was never trying to do me a favor. He had spotted a cheap asset and set me up, knowing full well I was down to my last savings. He calculated that I'd go broke trying to fix the roof, sink into debt, and then he could swoop in and buy the land back for next to nothing. And the mastermind behind this dirty scheme was none other than my brother Tyler. Tyler and Ross were working a shady joint hustle to quietly get grandfather's historical land back into Ryder Development's portfolio, while making me look like an absolute idiot in front of the whole town. It was a masterfully engineered family setup designed to leave me crushed. When Ross Fletcher called me that evening with another generous offer to buy the plot back for $43,000, I let him speak his piece, then replied calmly, "You thought I'd break and come running to you crying, Ross. That was the biggest mistake of your life," and hung up. I had a choice. Take the money, sell the collection through private brokers, and leave town forever. But that would mean slinking away like a whipped dog, leaving them the ultimate victory over the land. So I devised a completely different plan. I signed the official contract with the Phoenix auction house to run a public sale. As for the gas station building itself, I decided to repurpose it. I partnered with Garrett, the owner of a major construction firm from a neighboring county, whom my father had spent years trying to squeeze out of the Oak Creek market. Garrett, upon learning the details, loved the vision, transforming the old station into a concept museum restaurant that preserved the historical underground vault. My family was used to fighting dirty, using rumors, blackmail, and pressure. My father had already spread word around town that his irresponsible daughter bought trash, and good old dad is stepping in to absorb her losses. They were master storytellers. But stories crumble instantly when confronted with legal evidence. Every time family pressure escalated, I simply added another document to my binder. Auction contracts, legal opinions from independent counsel, official ownership records. They built their castles out of lies, while I built an unbreachable wall out of the law. 3 days before the gala, the public pressure on me went into overdrive. At the grocery store, people I had grown up with gave me cold glares and whispered behind my back. An anonymous, scathing op-ed appeared in the local newspaper about ungrateful, selfish children who tarnish the honorable names of their hard-working parents. A sickly sweet, venomous piece whose author I recognized as my mother from the very first line. My father had skillfully weaponized the entire town against me. In the eyes of the public, I had been cast as a bitter, ungrateful monster trying to ruin a great man's moment of glory. On Thursday, I drove out to the station. Inside the renovated shop floor, it smelled wonderfully of fresh pine, plaster, and paint. Garrett's crew was wrapping up the installation of the new roof framing. Standing in the middle of my shop, I felt a deep, rock-solid confidence for the first time in years. The ground beneath my feet belonged to me by law. The formal invitation to the gala was hand-delivered by my mother. It was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock with gold foil embossing. Mr. and Mrs. Dexter Ryder request the honor of their daughter Paige's presence at the celebration. Lorna stood on the threshold, her lips curled in disgust. Your father is offering you one last chance, Paige. He will step up on that stage and announce our family's reconciliation and our new joint venture. This is your only chance to act like a human being, put an end to this embarrassment, and wash off the mud. Acting like a human being in her vocabulary meant show up, publicly sign the deed transfer over to my father, and nod obediently on stage while playing the role of the repentant prodigal daughter. My father had even invited all the local press to capture this grand act of family mercy. I'll be there, Mom, I answered calmly, taking the envelope. My mother drove off, fully convinced that they had finally broken my spirit and forced my surrender. The night before the event, I didn't practice any fiery speeches. My family's strength had always rested on loud words, theatrical posturing, and emotional manipulation. Fighting them on their turf was pointless. Instead, I compiled a single, thick envelope. Inside, I carefully placed notarized copies of the land deed, the Phoenix auction contract, the expert appraisal, and grandfather's original 1931 promissory note. I set out a simple, elegant dark blue dress, went to bed, and slept soundly for the first time in 10 years. Tomorrow, my father would try to crush me in front of the whole town. But I had a response prepared just for him. The hotel ballroom was packed to capacity. 200 guests, the mayor, the entire town council, major investors, press, flashing cameras. The air was thick with expensive perfume and champagne. At a table near the back, I spotted the representative from the Phoenix auction house, a sharp-looking woman in a tailored suit whom I had invited as an official witness. I entered the hall wearing my dark blue dress, carrying my single paper envelope. My mother immediately intercepted me and ushered me to the family table in the front row, directly facing the stage. My father was holding court at the center of attention, graciously accepting handshakes and congratulations. The formal program began. The Chamber of Commerce chairman took the microphone and delivered a glowing 10-minute speech celebrating Dexter Ryder's immense contributions, his tireless work ethic, and his impact on our county. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Under a wave of camera flashes, my father walked up to the stage, accepted the crystal trophy, raised his hand for silence, and flashed a broad, practiced smile. He delivered a few standard words of gratitude, then pivoted seamlessly to the centerpiece of his script. As many of you know, my father began in a warm, deep, paternal tone. "Our family recently went through a challenging moment. My daughter Paige attempted to step into the business world on her own and purchased the old Carmichael station. Many in town thought it was crazy." Knowing chuckles rippled through the audience. "But we writers always stick together and support one another. And tonight, I am proud to announce this historic property is returning to the family portfolio under writer development. We will be turning it into a landmark project with the full and voluntary blessing of my beloved daughter." The room broke into applause again. My father turned to me, opened his arms, and gestured patronizingly. "Paige, sweetheart, come on up to the stage and say a few words to the community." 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me instantly. The photographer zoomed in. My mother was smiling triumphantly, while Tyler watched me with cold, victorious smugness. I stood up from my seat. Step by step, I calmly walked up the stairs, onto the stage, and up to the podium. With a winner's smile, my father handed me the microphone and tried to put an arm around my shoulders, but I smoothly stepped aside. "Thank you, Dad," I said. My voice echoed through the speakers, steady and completely devoid of fear. I opened my envelope and pulled out the papers. "I would actually like to share the real story behind Carmichael Station with all of you." I unfolded the first document. "First, I purchased that property with my own hard-earned money. It is registered exclusively in my name. Neither the family business nor my father has any claim or ownership over this land. Here is the certified deed." I laid the document on the podium right in front of the press reporters. "Second, in a sealed subterranean vault beneath the station, I discovered a unique, historic, Prohibition-era whiskey collection valued at over $1 million. It has been consigned for international auction through a contract signed by me as the sole legal owner." The second document dropped onto the podium. A dead, ringing silence fell over the massive room. The smile on my father's face began to slowly vanish. "And third," I continued, looking my father straight in the eye, "the most important part. While researching the archives, I located original documents from March 1931. Glenn Carmichael's promissory note, and the notice of foreclosure." I turned back to the audience. "My grandfather, Lyle Ryder, did not build his business from scratch, as you've been told for 40 years. I hold his signed note in my hands. He loaned money to a ruined man at predatory interest rates during the height of the Depression. And when Carmichael couldn't pay, my grandfather stripped him of his property through the courts. That is how the Ryder family fortune actually began, by preying on a desperate man and seizing his land." My father's face turned beet red in an instant. "That is a blatant lie!" he roared across the room, taking an aggressive step toward me with clenched fists. "Shut your mouth this instant and get off this stage." Tyler leaped from his seat in the front row, knocking his chair over with a loud crash. My mother clapped both hands over her mouth in horror, but I stood my ground, without taking a single step back. "It isn't a lie, Dad," I spoke directly into the microphone, without a shadow of hesitation. "The court records from the 1933 proceedings are on file at the county courthouse. Any journalist in this room is free to inspect them on Monday morning. And the papers on this podium are notarized copies of the originals written in our grandfather's own handwriting." The room was frozen in absolute shock. The mayor leaned forward, eyes wide. My father lunged to snatch the papers off the podium, but I calmly blocked his arm and slid the documents out of reach. "The original documents are locked in a bank vault right now, where neither you nor Tyler can ever touch them," I added clearly. At that moment, the representative from the Phoenix auction house stood up from her table at the back and spoke up loudly for the entire room to hear. "I formally confirm Miss Ryder's statement. The contract is valid, and Miss Paige Ryder's ownership rights are absolute. The auction will proceed as scheduled." A reporter from the main daily paper was furiously taking notes, while the photographer captured rapid flashes right into my father's red, furious face. Tyler rushed the edge of the stage, spitting mad. "You're going to regret this, you little bitch. Our lawyers will destroy you in court. You won't have a dime left." "You don't stand a chance in court, Tyler," I replied, looking down at my brother. "I have bulletproof, state-certified documentation for every single step I've taken. What do you have besides empty threats and shady bookkeeping?" My brother went silent instantly. He had nothing left to say. I turned to my father, who stood frozen on stage, holding his crystal trophy, looking utterly pathetic and ridiculous. "Congratulations on your award, Dad," I said quietly into the mic. "You really built a lot of structures in this town, but the Ryder family lie ends tonight." I gathered my papers back into my envelope, stepped off the stage, and walked unhurriedly toward the exit. Not a single soul in the room uttered a word. 200 members of the town's elite watched me leave in total, stunned silence. I walked out into the cool, crisp autumn night. I took a deep, full breath. The air smelled of freshness, dry leaves, and freedom. For the first time in my 33 years, I was completely, truly free. The auction in Phoenix 2 months later was a massive international success. My whiskey collection sold under the hammer for $1,350,000. The local newspaper ran a front-page exposé featuring photocopies of the 1931 documents. The town's perception of our family shifted overnight. The polished facade of town benefactors crumbled permanently. Realtor Ross Fletcher's reputation was ruined. No reputable agency in the county would work with him again. Tyler never dared to file a lawsuit, knowing that any serious audit would expose his own financial misdeeds at Ryder Development. My father was left with his crystal trophy, but he permanently lost the one thing he cared about most, the blind, unquestioning respect of the community. I never expected an apology or remorse from him. I didn't need it anymore. By spring, Garrett and I officially opened our venture on Highway 14. It is a thriving historical restaurant and museum. The underground vault, restored with its original Prohibition-era layout, became a premier attraction, drawing tourists from across the state. The building my family mockingly called a money pit became the unshakable foundation of my new, happy, and independent life. A month ago, my mother visited the station for the first time. She walked around the dining room in silence, looking at the history displays, then said softly, "We miss you, Paige. Isn't it time to stop being stubborn? Come back to the family. Your father is ready to put everything behind us." I looked her dead in the eye and answered calmly, "Mom, I never cut anyone off, but I will never ask for your permission to live my life or know my own worth ever again." Lorna looked at me quietly, and for the first time in 33 years, she couldn't find a single argument. She quietly finished her coffee and gently touched my hand before leaving. It was the most genuine gesture she had shown me in my entire life. Remember one simple truth: your true value never depends on the opinions of those who try to break you or shrink your potential. And sometimes, what those around you mockingly call your ultimate failure turns out to be the only real path to your true triumph. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. Share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time on Storytime Drama.